there's a baby that's not breathing. I was a brand new police officer. I didn't remember my training very well. Basically, it was an adult AED, and I didn't even know at the time, oh, you actually need a special one. I looked at it and I was like, I don't even know. And I was just started doing chest compressions.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today I am honored to have Jeff Mao with me. Jeff, thank you for joining me.
You are welcome.
Quick introduction on you. So you were a police officer and SWAT team captain, team lead, and also team member for 10 years from 2005 to 2015. Is that correct?
That is roughly correct.
Okay.
So I was a police officer. So when you become a police officer, you don't get to start out on SWAT. So
I would assume so, yes.
I worked patrol for a while. I joined the SWAT team after probably about 2 or 3 years. Actually lateraled from one agency to another agency. The teams that I were on were only collateral assignments, so they were part-time teams. So I still worked patrol,
Okay.
as well as SWAT. And then the second team I was on, I was an assistant team leader for a very short time.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll get in more
unsuccessful assistant team leader.
Okay. We'll get more into SWAT in a moment. And
Yep.
then you were a sheriff from 2015 to 2018.
Yep, and then I lateraled from a police department to the sheriff's office and worked for about 3 or 4 years, I guess.
And this is all in Seattle, correct?
It's all in
Seattle,
Seattle
Tacoma.
area.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then firearm training instructor for the past 11 years, or something like that.
Well, I first started teaching shooting and tactics and combatives and stuff right about the time that I became a police officer. So since about 2004.
Okay.
So about 20
As long
years.
as I've been alive.
Yep. So
Yeah.
about 20 years. I worked for a company called Insights Training Center. So I started taking classes with them prior to becoming a police officer, and then started being a coach and instructor. So I've actually been doing that for a fair amount of time.
Okay, there we go. And then you are the founder and head of strategy and development at Tenicor, whose building we are
Correct.
currently sitting in.
That is correct.
And on top of that, you're a father and a husband.
That
so
is correct.
lots of things.
Yep.
So we'll start off with SWAT and the police officer.
Okay.
Can we kind of define what is SWAT and in what way is it different from a regular police officer?
Sure. So SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. So some people refer to it as like when the patrol goes to an incident, and if an incident is either higher risk or larger scale than the patrol division can handle, then they might call in the SWAT team to help and assist with that. And so typically that's going to be things like a barricaded subject or a high-risk warrant service, things like that. Kind of the penultimate operation for a SWAT team would be a hostage rescue, which does not happen very often, and most SWAT people probably go their entire career without actually doing a hostage rescue.
Yeah, but it's like the police on steroids in the sense that it's specialized.
It is specialized, so you're going to have specialized training as a team to use team tactics and other tactics to hopefully resolve situations with minimal use of force.
Yeah, and localized, correct? Like you stay in your area?
Yeah, so typically like a law enforcement agency, a bigger agency might have their own team. Smaller agencies might do a multi-agency team. So they might, and so the teams that I were on were always multi-agency teams. So when I first started, I worked for Linwood Police Department, had like 70 officers or so, and we had like South Snohomish County SWAT, which is made up of like 4 or 5 different agencies. We were not a very busy team at all. And then when I lateraled to the Port of Seattle Police Department, again, about at 90 or so police officers at that time, but we were part of a 6-team multi-agency team that was all of South King County, which was like Kent and Tukwila and Federal Way, so a bunch of cities that were way busier than we were, and so that is actually a pretty busy team.
Okay.
One of the busier teams in the state of Washington.
Yeah, and what's the difference between that and kind of like an Army Ranger?
It is totally different.
Okay.
So, civilian law enforcement is civilian law enforcement, and the Department of Defense and the military is the Department of Defense and the military.
Okay, so it is a civilian.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, it's
for
not.
Sure.
Okay, it's not federal.
You work for a local, a city or a county, and you are a civilian. And you are employed by that county to enforce the Constitution and the laws of whatever jurisdiction that is, which is totally and completely different than anything in the military.
Yeah, because
there are tactics and procedures and things that you would use that might be similar in some ways to what people in the military do, And so there is sometimes crossover in training, but there's not. But as far as the actual job that you're doing, they're not similar at all.
Okay. So why'd you decide to go with SWAT and not the Army or the Navy?
So that's a good question. So I thought about joining the military at one point. I guess I was married in college, and so I was married and I needed a job, and so I got out of school and actually worked for Expedia.com for about 3 or 4 years before becoming a police officer.
I saw that on your LinkedIn.
And so, because I needed a good job, and so I did that, and
Yeah.
then I was like, this is super lame. I don't like sitting in an office, and I was at a conference and listened to somebody talking about calling, and I was like, I'm definitely not called to do this. I should go do something else, regardless of the money or anything else. So that's when I decided to be a police officer, and it seemed like being a cop was a way that I could continue to be a father and husband and mostly be home, and not, compromise the things that I cared about being an intentional father and intentional husband. This is all post September 11th. So September 11th happened when I was working at Expedia, and at that time I thought about it, I was like, maybe I should
Now
go
might
join
be a
the
good time
military.
to join the military.
And I decided not to. And then later on, after I was a police officer for a couple of years, so Lauren, my oldest, she was probably 2 or 3 at that time. I seriously considered the 18 X-ray program through the National Guard. The 18 X-ray program is like a special forces. You can go direct into special forces, and you can actually do it through the National Guard. There's several National Guard SF units. So like 19 Special Forces Group I think they're based out of Utah or Colorado, but they had people in Washington. And so I seriously looked into that for a time. And Vicki and we talked about it quite a bit, but basically there was about a 24-month period of training where most of that time I would be gone and away from
You were
home.
away, yeah.
But basically, like if you got in and you were accepted, and then basically like through basic training, through assessment, and through Q course and everything, it was like close to a 24-month cycle. And then after that, the whole point of me going in would be for me to do stuff, right? And so then you're looking at other 9 to 12-month deployments.
Yep.
And the point wasn't to just like get the GI Bill or something, right? I didn't care about that. The point would have been to go do things. And ultimately, I decided that to be the type of father and husband that I wanted to be, that was not conducive to being away for 24
9 to 12 months, yeah.
And then another 9 to 12 months, basically every other year.
Yeah.
So
that
I
makes
decided not
sense.
to do that.
But a
And
lot of people probably would have chosen their career. Why did you see fatherhood as more important?
the family that I have made covenant with my wife to be her husband and to be a faithful father to her children, and my children. I'm responsible for them, and that is a commitment that I made before people and before God that is more important than my vocation. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to actually work like a man ought to work, but I cannot. Their job is to help me do that thing well, and basically that. I guess for me, our decision was that type of job for our priorities. She wouldn't really be helping me; she would be picking up after me, right?
Yeah.
And I would be going to do this thing that I probably would enjoy doing, and I probably would have done pretty well at. But it would not have been a thing that, at least for us, we felt like we wouldn't be doing together. And then, it's pretty hard to be a good father and a good husband if you're not there. Like there is like if you're just
seems counterintuitive.
absentee father is very difficult. And sometimes men are called to do that for a time. Like if your country is genuinely at war or something, you might need to go do something for a time,
Right.
Which is a faithful thing to go do. But given the circumstances, I guess we were at war, but it wasn't the same sort of thing like other wars in the past have been.
Right.
And so I just felt like I could try to double down on where I was at and try to be faithful with where I was at and not be gone for extended periods of time.
Yeah, and I assume partly because of your drive to be a good father and husband, you moved here to Moscow from Seattle. Is that correct? Or was that not related?
I mean, we're talking a totally different timeline, so I'd say that's not related.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
But you did move here in
Yeah.
2019, correct?
We moved here in 2021.
Okay, so you were in Seattle for the riots and Chaz and all of that.
Yeah, we were we moved, our family moved in 2021. The business moved in 2022.
Okay. And then, so you were in Seattle. How were the riots and the whole Chaz and BLM and all of that? Were you dealing with that, or did the police
not
kind of stay
really.
out?
I guess my timeline, I left law enforcement in 2018.
Okay.
Right. So I guess that's some of the timeline. So, I was a cop from about 2005 to 2018. We started Tenicor probably 2015, 2016 is when we really started pushing to try to launch a business. And it was 2017, March of 2017, that we launched the website and started selling stuff. And then it wasn't until November of 2018 that basically I was doing 2 full-time jobs or more at the same time, where we were at a point where it made sense, or we believed the right thing was for me to leave law enforcement and do Tenicor full-time. And Tenicor started, like, we had a shop that attached to our house, like a 900 square foot shop, and that's where it started, and that's where I worked for the first couple of years. And so I had left law enforcement prior to COVID and Chaz and the riots and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was on the sideline, and I would say there was an element where I was super grateful that I was not involved in any of that, because that was difficult. I think it's difficult to basically be told don't do something when you know you should go do something.
Yeah.
And just letting these people who are politicians let things deteriorate in a way that is not right.
Did you have friends who were in the
and I had friends. So I
police?
talked to people who were in either downtown, involved in the riots and whatnot. It was kind of like the amount of restraint that was required of them is insane. And then other friends that worked at outside outlying agencies, and just basically the apathy and the lack of motivation and more on the side, like the frustration for the line officer and the basically administration saying don't do anything, is just frustrating.
Yeah.
And that was generally like law enforcement, at least in larger metropolitan areas and their suburban, rural, the places that are close to that, law enforcement, I think, has fundamentally changed. It is not the same at all.
Yeah, because some people, I would assume, left because it's like, well, then why am I here?
For sure.
Because if you're gonna say I can't do my job, then why should I even show up?
Yep, for sure. There are a lot of people frustrated and left, and a lot of it is though, like, you're on a pension, right? And it's like you're gonna mail in the last however many years, and some people are gonna mail it in for 10 years.
Yeah,
because that's just the nature of the thing. But then new people who come, like, they don't know any different. So like there's new cops that are all excited about what they're doing, and they just don't know any different. They don't know that they're not actually doing police work.
Yeah. 2020 changed that because suddenly people were saying they were trying to defund the police. Why? Surely that's not a good idea, counterintuitively. But why did everyone seem to think that was the right move going forward?
The people
defunding
who are trying
the
to
police.
defund the police.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a group of people out there who don't like the police and don't like authority and don't like, at least they don't like the rule and order that has existed for most of our country's time. And so they want some sort of other rule and order, because they want to be in power and authority. So if you remove the funding and the resources and basically the teeth of the existing, whatever it is, law enforcement or anything else, then you potentially can put something else in place of it. For the most, those things weren't that successful.
Yeah.
Right? Those movements didn't completely remove, we still have law enforcement pretty much everywhere. It might be handicapped in a significant way, but it's still all there. I mean, there is the law enforcement agencies exist law enforcement agencies exist to reduce liability, right? And that is
Right.
like as a baseline, that's what they are. They're there because like the insurance company would require it, right? The county or the city or whoever, like, to not have the rule of law and to not have that level of like accountability over people to follow the rules, like there would be chaos. You were in Africa recently, so
Yes.
you probably observed
Yes.
some of that. I mean, there's still law and there's still rule, right? So there's still grace in that, even in other areas of the world. But many areas in the world don't have as much order
No.
and consistency as America does.
One of the interesting things I noticed over there is the police are the law, or the law enforcement person, regardless of like in the immigration office. The law isn't the law. The law is whatever that immigration officer would like to enforce that day and that moment.
Yep.
And so they kind of make the law, whereas in America we like to think that like there's the law and then like you enforce the law and everyone is subject to it. Whereas there it's
and
like,
we do, while we don't do it perfectly,
no.
we do actually do it really well.
Yes.
Relative to most of the rest of the world and most of the rest of history. We actually have founding documents that drive like how people live. And,
Right.
And actually, as frustrated as we might be with where, even on both sides, whether you're a liberal or conservative, you might be really frustrated with where things are at. But there's an enormous amount of grace and order and freedom that we all have here because of those documents and the organization that has gone into founding America, and even in Moscow, Idaho, or wherever else you might be, right? And people generally follow those things.
Yes, and even not understanding that they are benefiting from those things.
Yep.
Let's say they had one. Let's say that they had successfully, defunded the police.
Yep.
Where do you think Seattle would have recovered and like put something else in order, or do you think that it would just be mayhem?
I mean, like if you're saying like they completely eliminated the police.
Yeah, let's
and,
say
like,
that they were
everybody's
successful
fired or laid off,
and they were like,
there's
we
some
completely
other
defunded the police.
I mean, that would have been chaos. I mean, there have been times, I forget I want to say it was in Minnesota or something, like in the 50s or 60s or something like that, where a law enforcement agency went on strike, and it was just complete and utter chaos.
And that's Minnesota.
Is it Minnesota?
No, I was just saying.
I don't remember. I just know that there was a mid 20th century sometime there was something like that occurred, and it was chaos.
Yeah.
And I think it would be like there is there are lots of things that might not be perfect, but we are all blessed by them. And there are lots of things. I mean, like, so in one sense, I think it's a little analogous to, like drug laws, right? So in some ways, I have some libertarian leanings. Like, I don't necessarily think it's the government's responsibility to restrict drugs. However, if there was if I had to vote tomorrow to remove all drug laws, I would not do that, because there is a legitimate restraint that has on it, that if you were to just unleash that on our society, I think the consequences would not be worth it. There's other reform in society that is required on different places and different levels before you're ready for something like that.
Yeah.
And I think if you removed law enforcement completely from any, like even here in our small town in Idaho, like you would have relative chaos.
Yeah.
And it would not be a good thing. And ultimately there would be somebody who would step up to enforce law, whether it is the appropriate people or not.
Most likely the private sector.
Yeah. You're going to have basically families and individuals who are going to decide to enforce some measure of law. And that would become problematic, right? Because you would then, it becomes
a mob.
Yeah. It would be more like your third world countries, where it's not based on what this document says, but what those people want.
Yeah.
And now you're just in a brute force situation.
In Cape Town, South Africa, I think the rate of private law enforcement, private security to police officers is 4-1.
Okay.
So they because no one trusts the government.
Yep.
No one trusts them to actually do anything. Basically, everyone built in their own security. Do you think that would have happened here, or do you think people would have?
Oh, for sure. The people who could afford it would get private security.
Yeah.
And it does. Like you could look at Katrina, right? Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans.
Yeah.
So that was complete and utter chaos. And most of it is not verified stuff, but if you talk to people who were there, people have crazy stories about all kinds of shenanigans and theft and murder and various things that occurred during basically a time of lawlessness in an area. And then there were, like, I have friends who worked as private security contractors who were paid by big companies to go down there and basically be private security because it was chaos. And the stories that they had were pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
I guess that, natural disaster sometimes is a good example of that. I mean, and really like the looting that occurs either during a natural disaster or during something like the riots that occurred around the country
Yeah.
as a result of COVID and racial tensions, right? I mean, you see the lawlessness that occurs, and it'd be even worse if there were genuinely no consequences for an extended period of time.
Yeah. Why do you think no one realizes that? Like they're shouting, "Let's defund the police."
I mean, lots of people realize it. It's just I don't. I think that the people who are advocates of defunding the police, I think there's probably two levels of people. There's people who know what they're doing and know what it will bring, and they're looking to bring in another. They're looking to basically overthrow the power structure.
They want that private sector.
They want that. Well, they want something, whether it's private sector or government or something. They're probably people who are looking to overthrow or basically do a power swap of some sort. But then there are people who are just evangelized to, and they're not thinking about it. And they're, someone tells them what is pleasing to their emotions about, oh, these people have oppressed you, and this, you're disadvantaged in these certain ways, and it's someone else's fault. It's not your fault. Right?
Yeah.
It's someone else's responsibility to fix it, not your responsibility to fix it, right?
Right.
And that, if you don't actually want to work and do something, that's very pleasing.
Yeah.
And so you are super attracted to that, and so you're going to vote for that, or you're going to support that cause because someone's going to come and give you a house, or someone's going to come and give you money, right? Someone's going to give you a universal income. Like that sounds really nice if you, if you don't work,
It sounds
and
safe.
you don't make any money.
It sounds safe.
Yeah, it's super safe. You don't have to do anything.
Right. Yeah. There is some, and on top of that, there is some actual police brutality that happens. Far less than is portrayed by the media and shown to happen. But there is some. From what you have seen, have you seen any of that actually happen?
Police brutality.
Yes.
I would say there is. So, law enforcement around the country is different, and so I don't have like actual practical experience in the South or on the East Coast. I've talked to people that I know that work in some of those places. The tone of stuff sometimes is a little different than what it is on the West Coast, or particularly in the Pacific Northwest. I think the Pacific Northwest, which is where I worked, I guess I would say with certainty that the professionalism and the integrity overall with law enforcement is relatively high.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that people in other places in the country don't have integrity and their professionalism is not high. I would just say
There's generally a higher standard.
Possibly, I guess. I mean, so I've heard stories of stuff happening other places that I'm like, I don't think that would happen in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think that would be tolerated
Right.
by the average police officer,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not trying to say that saying there's not professional, high-quality law enforcement officers in other areas. So I can just
Yeah.
speak on my own experience. And in my own experience, if you're talking about police brutality, I guess we'd have to define that. If you're thinking of, like,
Maybe
has anyone's
overreaction is maybe a better word.
like, do people's rights get violated sometimes on a small level? For sure.
Yeah.
They do. That's regular. Are people like beaten without cause? No, I've never seen that. I'm sure that happens from time to time. I think that almost never happens. I can't really of the publicized events that have occurred in the last, 5 or 6 years, there's really none of those events that stick out to me as like, oh, wow, that was really terrible.
Yeah.
And that was wrong. There's actually, once you understand all the details of it, they actually all kind of make sense.
Yeah.
And maybe there are usually there's compounding mistakes that occur.
Right.
And I may not have done it that way, but typically it's not outside like total unreasonableness, which is how media and popular culture want to portray most of those events. And so I would say generally, law enforcement is extremely professional, and excessive force. I guess the reality is, the biggest problem in law enforcement, and no one will like this in the world, but the biggest problem in law enforcement is that force is not used soon enough, and enough force is not used. There's actually too much restraint. And so what happens is you get in a situation and you don't end it immediately. You can actually use a pretty low level of force to end the situation immediately, but then you just let the whole thing
keep moving forward.
Yep, it keeps bubbling up, and it keeps becoming a bigger and bigger deal. It lasts longer, emotions get more intense, more people get involved. And now, instead of like taking care of it in the beginning, now you have a bigger, larger, more visible situation that's going to require more force. And it's like raising children, right? So like if you discipline your kids for the small things, right? You love your children, you discipline them for the small things, particularly when they're young. Then when they're older, like there's not as many big things.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the same, that is just a truism of life.
Pull the weeds when they're small.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that is really probably the challenge. There's not enough force used soon enough. And even, I can remember many roll calls sitting around debriefing like some use of force incident or something. And usually even the administration would come back and they were like, yeah, this is great, totally justified. You could have done that. You could have done more, and you could have done it quicker.
Yeah.
And usually that is the issue. And really that comes from our subconscious, right? We like, it is the rare person who is either a sociopath or has done enough use of force that it doesn't bother them at all. And even for the big bravado tough cop, they want to put forward the image that it's no big deal. But human conflict is a problem.
Right.
People avoid conflict, and everybody avoids conflict in some manner, who's not a sociopath. And so you're in a tense situation with somebody, and the reality is you don't
want to act.
You don't want to act. And it takes,
but then that lack of
takes
action.
training and experience to know that you need to act.
Yep.
And then you have to force yourself to act. And when you force yourself to act, the situation is resolved faster and sooner and with less problems.
Yeah.
And so law enforcement officers not being competent in the use of force and then them showing too much restraint is really the problem.
Yeah.
Right? If everybody was a black belt in jiu-jitsu who was a cop, there would be far less problems.
Yep.
But the reality is that's, most cops are relatively incompetent in using force and using the tools that they have. And so that then compounds things.
Escalates.
Most of the videos you see where there are problems, oftentimes it involves somebody who is not super competent.
Yeah. So it's not just hesitancy to, like, I don't want to put on a bad image for cops. It's more of like, this is a violent action that I'm going to take against another human, and second thinking that.
No, I think there's all kinds of reasons why someone would be hesitant to do it. And their personal welfare, whether they're going to get hurt, is going to be a part of it. Being sued, that's going to be a part of it. What is their family or there's all sorts of things that are going to go, or whether they're justified or not. There's all sorts of things that would go into the hesitancy. It's going to be relative to different people.
Yeah.
But the reality is most police officers are probably more hesitant, even the ones who are super experienced and do a lot of action. Ultimately, unless you're like some crazy wicked person or sociopath, like you ought to have some level of hesitancy to hurt another person or to to arrest somebody or whatever. You want to make sure that you're justified in that.
So how do you solve that problem of making sure that they use the right amount of force at the right time?
It's training and experience.
Okay.
So that people just need training to disciple themselves and their actions and their mind to truly understand what they are legally justified in doing, and working that out in scenarios and practice, and get experience doing things.
Yeah, that makes sense. After George Floyd died, you had friends who were in kind of dealing with the Chaz, but then there's also sometimes when police officers just won't respond in certain. I know my uncle lives in Atlanta, and
Okay.
he said that there's some parts of Atlanta where if a crime happens, police officers won't even go in there.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Yep. Depending
Why?
on the crime,
Okay.
right? So that's the liability thing, right? So there's some places it's like, oh, someone broke into you and stole stuff out of your car. Okay, yeah, no one's going to come investigate that. Fill out a report online, and no one's going to come because it's a waste of our
Right.
time and it's too dangerous. We don't want to get involved with that. If there is a murder in that place, the police are probably going to go investigate that because the liability is too high to not investigate it. But they're probably going to have a pretty significant presence when they go and do that. Right?
Yeah. But there's some parts, I think, especially in Atlanta, but at least that's what I know, that they know that if they go in there, there's going to be a gunfight. And so they don't ever go in there.
Yeah, unless they have to.
Right.
Is that
the right move, or is that because at some point that has to you can't just forever have a part of a city where there's gunfights all the time.
Yeah. So, no, right? The right answer is to reform that area of the city, both from a cultural, family, church, economic, civil, and legal perspective. That is the right answer.
Yeah.
But it is not the reason that those things are like that in those places. There's places a friend of mine who was an LA cop. He'd be like, yeah, we don't go to this area without 8 of us, right? I mean, there's I don't even have 8 people who work on my crew when I was working patrol, so that's
right.
not even an option. And so those sorts of things, is that right that that's like that? No, it's not. They ought to be solved, but it's not law enforcement's job to solve that, right? The problem there is not really a issue of law. It is a broader cultural issue that would need to get solved. And law enforcement's job is to mostly react.
Yeah, and not. So, can you maybe talk to the dangers of not reacting, but going forward? I guess it's proacting, if that makes sense.
And
acting
what?
before anything has happened, going in.
With regard to what?
With regard to a police officer who's looking at a situation and they escalate things too quickly. And react too quickly before anything has actually happened.
Yeah, so a police officer, so in that context, that police officer should be proactive, right? You're called to a scene, you're doing something, you're seeing things unfold. If you go nip it in the bud sooner, it will work out better. You have a husband and a wife who are, you show up at a DV scene, they're yelling at each other, they're fighting, and the right answer isn't just to stand there and let them yell at each other because it's probably going to escalate. The right answer is to separate them, right, and to try to de-escalate the thing and figure out what happens.
Yeah.
So there certainly is an aspect where you need to be proactive. Or if you are, there's a high crime area, police presence, being proactive in that area will reduce the crime. And then also going and contacting people that, appear to be suspicious in some way that might be contributing to the crime that is occurring in that area. You would proactively go contact those people because cockroaches don't like the light. So if you shine light on them, they'll scurry away. Right, so from that aspect, you ought to be proactive. But if the broader cultural issue is fatherlessness, is the thing that is actually causing
Police
this.
Can't help that.
Police cannot help that, right? And that's I remember back in I'm working nights, and Barack Obama would always come on the radio and talk about fatherlessness. There was a ad council commercial from like the probably 2014 to 2016-ish time frame, where he's always talking about fatherlessness.
Really?
I always thought that was super interesting, that
Yeah.
that he or whoever in that world recognizes that that actually is the problem. And you could chase, fatherlessness is probably something you could be the root potentially of almost every societal problem that there is.
Yes.
And ultimately, you're not going to make that place safe for people, for the police to go in or whatever, and not get in a gunfight until you solve like the fatherlessness problem or whatever other issue is the true underlying issue that is a problem in that community.
Yeah. What are your best stories from your SWAT days?
I don't really have best stories. I'm not much of an action storyteller. I'm more of a making a point commentary social or storyteller. So yeah.
Did you have any wild experiences though where
So I guess most of my experiences are probably like sad or like. So like I remember, a few times, and I remember the first time this happened, of basically going to like an AED call for a baby, which is like no heartbeat, right? And sitting there and basically like, as a police officer, you're almost always going to get there before fire does. So you show up on scene, you pull your AED out, and there's a baby that's not breathing. And I'm like, okay. And I brought my AED in, and just frankly, like I was a brand new police officer. I didn't remember my training very well. And it really, I was like, I need to, after this, because basically it was an adult AED, and I didn't even know at the time, oh, you actually need a special one.
I was going to say, that
right?
seems
It's
a little
not,
too large.
Yeah, it's not going to work. I like looked at it and I was like, I don't even know. And I just started doing chest compressions, and opening the airway and until fire showed up. And that was one of the early incidents that really stuck with me for a bit. And it's that type of stuff that as a police officer, like most people don't have an experience of being around a dead baby when the baby just died, right?
Yeah.
And you get to do that kind of thing as a police officer. And those are the kind of things that stick with you sometimes. And I remember, Lauren was probably 1-ish when that happened, right? And I just went home.
That hits you hard,
yeah. It was late at night. I went home and hugged her.
Yeah.
And just held her for a while. And that kind of thing is difficult. And that's why a police officer's job is a challenge, that people don't appreciate those sorts of things. Another incident that struck me, I guess a contrasting incidents that struck me early on was the first time I was called racist. It's like the first time, I, as a Asian American, I have experienced racism. Not that much, because I've mostly lived in the Pacific Northwest and middle or upper middle class America, but I lived on the East Coast for a time and experienced it, and I've gone to other places and people making fun of you because you're Asian or whatever, right? In a way that is not like friends joking around, but genuinely they don't like you because you're weird. That is a thing that exists in America, right?
Yeah.
And I have never been called racist before. So I'm like a young cop. I pull up on this traffic stop, and there's this 20-something black gal sitting in there, and I'm like, she had expired tabs or something on her car. I pulled her over for that, and she just lays into me, starts yelling at me, and you effing this and effing that, you're racist, and why are you pulling me over? And I'm just like, whoa, okay. Okay, let's reset here. I'm trying to
calm
be
down.
calm, and you have your driver's. You're like, no, I don't have my, that you don't need my driver's license, and blah 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 blah, and just on and on and on. And I'm like, okay. So she verbally gives me some information, and then I go back to my patrol car and I run stuff, and I start basically. What you quickly learn is anyone who does not have ID is almost certainly lying to you, right? If they say they don't have
that
ID,
makes sense.
They are almost certainly lying to you. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time, right? Anyone who doesn't know their social security number is almost certainly lying to you. Another trick that I had was asking people what their sign is, their astrological sign. because most people, even though they're not into that, know what their sign is, right?
Really?
And
That's
their
funny.
sign is associated with their birth date, right? So you get them
Yeah.
to tell you their name, their birth date, and then like, what's your sign? And they're like, if they're lying to you, the sign and the birth date are probably not going to match up, or they're going to argue with you why it's stupid. So that was a
I have
little
no
trick.
idea what my sign
Okay.
is.
And some of that may be culture has changed, right?
Yes.
And so at least at the time, that worked really well. So I go and I research stuff and basically figure out that that's not who that is, and there's actually this other gal who uses that lady's information all the time, and that's probably her. And ultimately, she didn't have a driver's license, and she had a warrant for her arrest, and all of this stuff. So I ended up arresting her, and I was like, "Oh, okay, this is how that works."
So it's usually the people who are already in trouble that call you racist, or
So early in my career, yes. So again, if you don't have your driver's license, you're probably lying about who you are because you probably have a warrant or you have something else you don't want me to find out about. If you are calling me racist, you are also probably lying about who you are, or you have something. You're trying to put up a smokescreen to make me hesitant,
Right.
so that I don't investigate.
Yeah.
That I would say from early in my career, and so the change was Ferguson. So Ferguson was that was like the first Black Lives Matter type movement.
okay.
That was like 2015, 2016, like the hands up, don't shoot me, like all that stuff, which you probably don't remember because you're too
No.
young. But
No.
you should go research that.
Okay.
Because that would be like the precursor to
George Floyd.
George Floyd. Yep. And law enforcement, I think, fundamentally changed really with Ferguson and not with the COVID riots and George Floyd and all that.
In what way?
Because that's when the racial tensions in the more overt way started. So like I had that experience up until like 2015 with if people were calling me racist, it's because they were criminals and they were playing a game. And I knew the game, and we knew the game, and it was just like this thing we did. Right? And we all knew it. And then post Ferguson and all of that, 2015, 2016, an example is I get called to a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And there's a bunch of Hispanic people that work in this Kentucky Fried Chicken behind the counter, and they call because they have this unruly customer that they've asked to leave, and he won't leave. And I show up, and it's this guy, this probably in his mid-60s, nice-looking guy wearing like a tracksuit, and he happens to be black, he is heated and upset, and he's yelling at them, and they're asking him to leave, and I'm like, "What's going on? Why?" I start talking to him, and he just starts laying into me about me being racist. And then I come to find out he's like a retired Boeing like mechanic, worked at Boeing for 20 some years. Before that, retired from the Air Force. And I'm just like, what alternate reality am I in that this guy is yelling at these people? I mean, he's probably just having a bad day, but he's yelling at these people, and he's causing a scene, and they don't want to serve him because of that. And now I'm asking him to leave, and he's telling me I'm racist because he's causing this problem. And
Yeah.
like, that wouldn't have happened 10 years earlier.
Right.
And so that is the change. So there was this distinct change between only being called racist by criminals to being called racist by normal people who happen to be upset about whatever.
Because it's just another thing they can throw at you.
Yeah, and it was a bizarre thing. And I would like also being called racist by passerbyers, right? Another incident that stuck out to me was arresting a bunch of kids for a robbery that had occurred, and I have them like proned out, and they are all African American kids. There's like 2 of them that I had contacted, and like proned out. They're in handcuffs, and I have people walking by yelling at me.
You're racist because
being
you're
racist
arresting
because I'm arrested, and it's like they have no idea
the situation.
that these guys just beat this person up and stole stuff from them.
Right.
They are legitimate like
criminals,
like class A felony criminals. They have no idea, and these people are walking by yelling at me for being a racist. I'm like, this is bizarre.
Yeah. So how do we get back to pre-Ferguson?
I don't think we want to get back to pre-Ferguson because pre-Ferguson got us to
Got us to Ferguson.
I mean, like where we were 20 years ago got us to where we are now. So
Right.
we don't want to actually go backwards.
Yes, but as far as like not having people think of cops as inherently racist.
Yeah. How do we get back to that? I think fathers should be
back to fatherlessness.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's back to fatherlessness. I think pastors should preach the truth and should hold people to the truth, and they should be willing to call out sin. And fathers should stop sinning and not abandoning their children and their wives. And they should take ownership and responsibility for the thing that they have promised to do. And if that begins to happen, I mean, like you can only control yourself and your family. So each individual has to do that. But then we have to have some level of community and camaraderie in culture where people are encouraging one another to do that sort of thing.
Right.
And as that occurs, yeah, I mean, I think that is the type of thing that will create cultural change. And there's not like fatherlessness exists in poor community. I mean, well, I guess I worked in inner city areas, and I worked in rural areas, and I worked in some of the richest areas you could possibly work in. And the theme of fatherlessness was true in all of those places.
Right.
So you can have someone that lives in a $2 million home and their kid goes to a fancy private school that costs $60,000 a year. And there's a whole lot of fatherlessness and emptiness in that kid, just like there is for somebody who,
is scraping by.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so those things, and you can have someone who's faithful, who's scraping by, where there's not fatherlessness, and you can have someone who's rich, that the father is taking responsibility and
Right.
investing in their children and their wife and their family and leading them in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
And so that is, I think, the theme. And again, Barack Obama gets that because he used to run commercials
Right.
that talked about
Ironically.
that. Yep, ironically. And yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that going through the church is the way to get back, to become a society where fatherlessness is kind of eliminated?
Well, I'm a Christian, so
yes.
I'm kind of like.
But do you think there is also another way where, like, just societal,
No.
we need to shift?
I mean, to do things not in the name of Christ is to do something in vain. And so can you act like a Christian ought to act and receive some sort of positivity out of that? Yes, you can. So that would be better than not, right? That would be like common grace on society or on a family or whatever. But ultimately, it would be in vain. And ultimately, like the society is going to go the direction of the church, right? And so the church has to lead. And in the lack of leadership or I would say for a time there's probably a lack of leadership or absenteeism in the church, but now we're probably more in the church more broadly is actually pushing in a negative direction, is pushing
Yeah.
to justify people's actions based on emotional things and not based on what the Bible says.
Right. Yeah.
And so like that would have to stop. You'd actually have to have broad
Reform.
in the church before anything significant would probably happen.
Yeah. What is the purpose of man then? Of men, shall we say, rather than just man, of men? Is it to be useful? Is it to...
I think the purpose of like not men in general, but a man is to go, is to take dominion over the world. That is his purpose. And his family's purpose is to support him in that.
Yeah. When you, as you were becoming a cop, did you kind of, can you talk maybe to the importance of pushing yourself as a man, physically and mentally, to your limits to an extent, and how, and because I think that's probably one of the things that would be helpful. There's a lot of laziness and obesity, and usually the people who are lazy and obese are the ones who are being idiots, shall we say. What is the importance?
Sometimes there's a correlation, sometimes there's not. I mean, there's definitely a correlation to Well, I mean, I know some really disciplined people that are not in great shape, and I know some
Right. But for young
I know
men,
some people who are in really great shape that actually don't have a lot of discipline in their life too, right? There's
yeah,
like you can have discipline in certain areas. I think as men, well, here's a true like we live one day as a Christian, you would be glorified, right? But that would be in heaven. And so on this earth, the only thing that we have is sanctification. Okay? I think one of the false things that we want to believe in is people are trying to achieve unknowingly glory or glorification on earth, right? So people who are hyper focused on milestones and arriving. So like graduating high school, graduating college, getting this new job, getting married. There's a temptation to believe that if I achieve this thing, life will be good, right?
right.
Which I think is a way in which people are foolishly trying to achieve glory on earth rather than embracing their sanctification, right? And that's where they get dissatisfied and become discontent with things because they get to that threshold and they're like, oh, it's actually not better. Like I got married and it's not better.
Now there's more things to do.
Yep, there's more things to do. And the reality is the hardest thing to do in your life is always in front of you. And that's just how God made the world. And so whatever is the hardest thing that you have done at this point in your life, there's something more difficult.
Yeah.
And the reason why you haven't faced that thing is because you're not ready for it, right? And so there are things going to come into your life, and those could be hard emotional things or physical things or whatever else, right?
Both.
It's like,
yeah.
or all of the above, right? And so I think as a man, to be a faithful man, to do difficult things is important, right? To challenge yourself and to push yourself to do things that you don't want to do because you are going to be faced with the hardest thing you've ever done
With situations.
is always in front of you, right?
Right.
So if you are not used to doing difficult things, then it's going to be really difficult to be productive when that hard thing comes, and it will come. And so that is extremely important. And so whether that is working out or running or some other physical thing, or whether that is studying, right? There is, Vicky and I were talking about, I think probably going around on the socials about comparing math students in Japan versus math students here.
Yes.
Right? And the big difference is that math students here rarely in America are challenged. They feel like they're doing stuff that they don't know or that it's difficult. And math students over in Japan are almost always challenged and doing things that they don't know or understand. And so you can do hard things that are intellectual. You can do hard things that are study things. We don't do that very often in school. Oftentimes it's easy things.
Especially now because they're lowering the standards even more.
And even in private schools and in homeschool, that is the case, right? It ends up being, there's also a difference between busy work, like hard thing is in volume of work, versus an actual intellectually hard thing that challenges you and pushes you, right? Both of those things are good, but if you're always doing busy work all the time, so the volume of work is difficult, that is an aspect of things, but is not, there needs to be balance with actual busy work that's hard for a time, but also intellectual challenges that are hard, but then physical challenges that are hard, right? Mostly people will, so you can have somebody who is doing something that's physically very hard, but to them it's not. And they're actually being lazy. They might be in awesome shape, but they just love working out and they love lifting weights and they just they get off on it. And that to somebody else, what they're doing might be a hard thing. Right? That's where the truism of relativism, God actually made the world relative to people, right?
Yep.
And so you can have something that is easy for one person and hard for another. And so to be a man, you have to be willing to go find the things that are difficult and go embrace those things. So when the genuine hard thing, whether that is a sickness or a job loss or whatever, or a death actually occurs, you are able to have perspective and go embrace the thing and be thankful for it and drive forward and be productive in that situation.
Yeah. But society as a whole, just especially in America, is kind of the incentive structure is towards laziness, towards not doing that hard thing. How do we get to a place where the standard is much higher, that you will do hard things in school, in life, whatever it is?
So we can't force societal change. You can only affect yourself and the people who are immediately around you.
Which to an extent is forcing societal
which
change.
eventually will, so if you're patient, and if you're faithful with it and you're patient, that will make societal change. So I think by individuals being consistent and faithful over decades or generations, you will have change. The other way to force that would be for really, really bad things to happen, not fake bad things like we have now. Like we don't actually have, like people fuss about stuff, but for like we're the richest country
First
that has
world
ever
problems.
existed. And so even the people who are
Complaining on an iPhone.
are historically are obscenely wealthy,
Yeah.
right? And everything is obscenely easy for all of us, including myself. And so there's very little physical challenge that we are faced in America,
Right.
Which isn't true. I mean, obviously there are genuinely people who have some sickness or some hardship.
Yeah.
Like those are genuine hardships. We all have hardships in our lives. But relative to maybe the rest of the world or to history, it's not. And as long as you have those things, and as long as you have government and other organizations that are giving people stuff that is creating complacency, right? I mean, all of that has to be removed ultimately.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be the fast way to do it. If you want societal change to happen in the course of 10 to 20 years, it probably has to be
Drop
some
welfare.
sort of terrible thing that happens to
Yep.
all of us.
Yeah.
The other way is going to take 50 years, 100 years, 200 years.
Yeah. Is there? I would assume that the 200-year way is better, but there is also an argument that like the 20-year way, you got to put the metal in the fire to remove the dross.
I think that's something we don't control, right? So whether it is war or famine or
That's true,
calamity
yeah.
of some other sort, right? Those are the sorts of things that would bring forth change in a 10, 20, 30
God's
year
timeline
period.
is a little
Yep.
different than ours.
So our timeline to change things would be much slower. But we should try to change things and try to be faithful where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you work with a lot of guns. We're
I do
surrounded
work with
by
a lot of guns.
ammo holsters and things. Do you think that every man, or at least every father, should be qualified to know how to use a gun and should own a gun?
No, I don't.
Okay. Why?
I think every father, husband, leader of his home is required to protect his home and his family. But to protect your home and your family does not necessarily require a specific object to do that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It would be like saying, as you have a job, you have to commute to work. So is every father required to know how to drive a car? Right?
Not really.
Of course not.
No.
Right? It seems crazy that one wouldn't in our society today.
Right.
But
you
of course
should,
not.
But you.
Should you? Right? So
Yeah.
if you can walk to work and you can walk to church and you can walk to the store, you can walk to everything that you need to provide for your family. Do you need to know how to drive a car?
I would still say yes.
Why?
Because in the situation that you are in danger, you don't want to have to be walking away or running away from something.
Why not?
Because let's give it a situation that imagine someone breaks into your house, then driving away if it escalates too quickly is a much safer option for you and your family than running.
what if you have some other option where you don't even need to leave? You can barricade if we're getting into like weird little details of things, you barricade yourself in some part of your house. I guess my point is the principle is you need to be able to utilize transportation in an effective way, right? And it'd be pretty rare for someone to be able to do that without knowing how to drive. But if someone lives in New York City, and they don't ever, they live in some major metropolitan area, I mean, I think someone could be a faithful father and a faithful husband and not know how to drive a car.
Yes, I can see that.
Okay.
In a metropolitan city, I
and
think I was
so-
thinking of Moscow.
Yeah. And so I think, are there other means that one could use to protect their family? Absolutely, there are.
Right.
And a faithful thing is to put some level of reliance on local law enforcement, right? You pay
Yep.
taxes for a reason. Their job is to do high-risk things for you as the taxpayer, right? You're there, and you should rely on them for some things. And
They're
it's not,
specialized.
yeah, it's not unreasonable for you as a husband or father to utilize that resource for the protection of yourself and your family in some way. And so, no, I don't think, like, the absolutism of that, I think, is not right. It is like, what is the principle of it? The reality is similar to a car, though. We do live in America, right? We live in that. We have this. You have a gun that is a effective and relatively convenient way to defend yourself or to defend your family. I think it would be good if it did. I think, like, America is the only gun culture. I think there is something unique about guns that, like, there is a, like, it's a machine. It requires maintenance. It requires skill to use it. It requires discipline to learn how to use it effectively.
And in the correct situation.
And in the correct situation. There are things that are unique about guns that I think if everybody owned guns and everybody actually spent time learning how to use them well and use them appropriately, I think our society would be better off.
We'd be safer.
We would be safer. We would be more competent. We would be more disciplined. There is something that is unique about guns and gun training that is hard and frustrating.
What do you mean?
So the actual usage of the gun in a so if you were to come to class with me and learn how to shoot a gun, you would be challenged in unique ways that you have never been challenged in your entire life. And most men are afraid to do that because they are insecure, because they believe that a plaid shirt and a gun and a glass of scotch makes them a man, right? But the mere possession of the gun just makes you a gun owner. It does not mean that you know how to use it effectively. Yeah. Just like owning a cool car, right? Like, most people think if you ask, are you an average driver? Most people are going to say they're average to slightly above average. But if everybody is average to slightly above average, it doesn't work.
That means it's the average.
Yeah. Or the reality is, the average person is average. And there's a whole bunch, and there's just as many people that are below average as there are above average.
Right.
Right? But no one would admit that. And the same thing with firearm usage, right? Most people are like, oh, I could shoot pretty well, or I could do this pretty well, or yeah, I know how to. I mean, I've carried a gun before. Most people are actually extremely incompetent with firearms.
That makes sense.
And most people are not humble enough to
admit their incompetency.
Yeah, admit their incompetence and then go learn how to use them correctly. Particularly in the context of self-defense. Like, you'd have different disciplines, right? If you are a precision target shooter, that is a different discipline. And you would have to learn how to do that. If you are, shooting, upland birds is a different discipline than shooting long distance, shooting bull elk at 500 yards or 1,000 yards or something like that, right? Those are all different disciplines that you would need to learn. But the idea that the average person or the average man, because he owns a thing, is relatively proficient at that thing is nonsense. And I think the intersection of the mindset that goes into using a gun, the complexity that goes into doing all the physical skills with competence, the repetition that is needed, the discipline that is needed, the mechanical nature of it. I mean, guns are actually pretty complex and unique of integration of physical and mental and like mechanical and human performance and all of that. It is a interesting and unique thing, and people who spend time with it like will probably understand what I'm saying. People who haven't ever experienced it probably won't.
Yeah. So would you recommend that most people get a gun and learn how to train?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
But do you think that there's a certain level of, I would assume that there's a certain level of maturity that's you need to have before you get a gun, or does that come with gun training?
I mean, it'll come with gun training. I mean, like a 5-year-old shouldn't just go get a gun,
Yes.
right? So yes, there's a certain level of maturity. There's a certain level of maturity that is required to go get training, right? Because most people are not mature enough, they're not humble enough to go seek out instruction from someone else. They're like, I'm going to figure it out myself.
Right.
And it is high levels of performance with a gun are not intuitive at all, right?
No.
And the same, like going back to our previous conversation about law enforcement, you asked like, what is the answer? Like, well, it's training, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things cops do is carry guns and shoot guns. And most police officers probably have a week to 2 weeks of training in the academy with firearms. And then they're going to have once or twice a year some sort of in-service or qualification, which is almost infinitely more training than the average gun owner has, right?
Yep.
But is not sufficient.
Really?
Oh, not at all.
So how long would you, like, is this like a 6-month situation where you need to in depth?
A police officer should be training with their gun for the rest of their life, or for their entire time that they're in law enforcement, right? And is a personal discipline thing. Like, there's not enough time. It's a question of the quality of the training and then the intentionality of the person doing the thing. Like, if you want to be good at something, what do?
You practice it every day.
So
10,000 shots.
The average high school football team. Okay, how much time do they spend training football?
2 hours every day.
2 hours
Whatever
every day.
It is. 2 or 3 hours, yeah.
And what do they do before the season?
They work out, they train.
Okay, so the average high school football team in a season has way more training in playing football than a police officer has in using their gun.
And there's far less risk.
There is far less risk. Yep. So the average high school football player is going to go to like a camp or something like that, all right? They're going to do 2-a-days or something for a couple of weeks leading up to it, right?
Right.
And they're training a couple hours every single day. And the people that are really good, what are they doing?
They're doing extra.
They're doing extra, right? So if you want to be good at something, you actually have to put work into it, and it has to be consistent work over time. And it's not you don't achieve a certain state. It's a process that you will always be. And I'm not saying everyone who owns a gun needs to practice as much as a high school
This is
football
police
team.
officers.
So a private citizen could do that as well. I'm just saying, like, think about how good your average high school football player is at football, which is not very good.
Right.
The average person, right? And how much more they're training for football than you are for using your gun. How much more of a tense situation is you using your gun in a lethal force versus a football game? And how much time and energy have you then put into using your gun?
Right.
Nothing. You bought it.
That's not good enough.
No, not at all. And you should expect, almost you should expect failure. At a minimum, you should expect a pretty low level of performance. And usually what happens is you have survival.
Yep.
Right? You don't have success. Mostly in private citizen uses of force with a lethal force with a firearm or law enforcement, you have survival and not success. And people are like, they want to high five the survivor and give them a trophy or give them a medal. And that is totally inappropriate. We're just rewarding mediocrity.
Yeah.
You should want to be successful and not just be a survivor.
And by success, you mean?
By success, I would say, like, the situation is presented in front of you and you proactively do things to solve that situation, and you're not bumbling through the situation, right? So you have training and experience that you are presented with a situation and you have reasonable answers to solve that situation.
Right.
Which would be like on the football field, right? Sometimes you have success and sometimes you have failure. Sometimes you have survival. So sometimes a play happens, right?
And you survived the play.
And you survived the play, which is probably happens more often than not for most people,
Yep.
right? And you either have to have a high level of athletic ability and a good amount of training, or an average amount of athletic ability and a whole lot of training
Yep.
to consistently be successful, right?
In those uncertain situations.
Yep.
From the standpoint of not from a father protecting his kids, but from the standpoint of an American citizen who is from the Second Amendment, right? You have guns so that you can defend yourself and defend your country from attacks, foreign and domestic.
Mm-hmm.
Should every man get a gun and learn how to use it?
Again, I would say no.
So
not
some
every
men,
man. I would say most men and almost all men, but there are some men whose job is not going to be like, they're just not given towards that. So not everybody, like someone needs to do the data analytics. Someone needs to, like, there's
Right.
people who need to do other aspects that support the people that are going to go like shoot people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And those people are good and great people who are faithful men who are
The people who build the
supporting
planes.
the cause. Yeah. Potentially the people that build the planes. But if you're talking about like all society is mobilizing for war or something like that, like you would be foolish to have everybody stand on the front line.
Correct.
Right. And you would want to take the people who are given towards that sort of activity and put them on the front line. And you would want the other people who are given towards
A different
other activity who are supporting that cause.
Yeah.
Right. And those people don't need to learn to use a gun or carry a gun in the same way that the other people do.
Yeah.
And so I think it'd be silly to say each and every individual man without exception needs to have a gun and know how to use it. That being said, again, I go back to, I think you will be a better man if you do. So
Right.
I would, as an individual, I would challenge any individual and be like, yeah, you should get a gun and you should learn how to use it. Because I think you'll be a better person if you put some time and energy into that.
But as far as like, some people are called to data analytics, but you don't know when you're going to be on the front line, if you're going to be on the front line, right? You get put in uncertain situations. So should you not prepare for the worst?
You could, but like, that could go all sorts of different ways. So like if you're thinking about preparing for the worst for some foreign or domestic attack, then should we all be going and doing like patrols on the weekends in the woods, like prepping? So there's one aspect of is like, and this is common. You get focused on the equipment. So Tenicor's, like there's Tenicor, and then our kind of slogan is mindset, tactics, skill, and equipment, and that is based on the priorities of survival. And so, because the thing that is the most important is mindset, and then tactics, and then skill, and the last thing is equipment.
Right.
What most of us want to flip that around though. Most of us just want to focus on equipment.
Yep.
Whereas,
because it's fun to purchase things.
Because it's fun to purchase things. It's a toy, which is the wrong answer. So like, if somebody, is some samurai sword expert, and they're, do they need to have a gun to protect their family if someone breaks into their house?
No.
Probably not,
No.
right?
A black belt in jiu-jitsu.
Potentially not, right?
Probably not, yeah.
Could you be a faithful husband who is protecting their family and you don't own a gun? 100% you can.
Yes.
Right?
But exceptions don't make the rules.
Why does there need to be a rule though about it?
I'm not saying there should be a rule, but I am saying that like,
so
if we're going to say generally men should.
Yeah, generally in our society today, a man will be better off if he owns a gun and knows how to use it. A man is probably not better off if he just owns a gun.
Yep.
He actually might be worse off.
Right.
Because it's mindset, tactics, skill, and equipment. So how you have the piece of equipment, but if you have no mindset, tactics, or skill to be able to utilize that equipment, the equipment is actually useless and it might be counterproductive.
It's just as dangerous to others as it is to the harm.
It could be.
Yeah.
Right? But if you have the right mindset, tactics, and skills and you don't have the equipment, you'll probably be successful.
Right. People are constantly trying to take down the Second Amendment. whether in the Supreme Court and Congress or just doing little pro anti-gun rallies. Why
Okay.
is that people are so scared of guns? Is it just a lack of familiarity?
I mean, again, it would go back to different societal problems. I mean, different people are going to have different reasons or motivations. So certainly for some people, they don't understand guns. So they're not familiar with them, as you pointed out. I would agree with that. A lot of those people they're just the kind of low-level people who are misinformed and are uneducated about it. They're the people who are voting, but they're easily swayed. On a higher level, why do they want guns restrained? I mean, I think the Second Amendment is not, I know it's kind of cliche to talk about it these days now, but it is true. The Second Amendment is not for hunting and is not for personal defense. It is for defense against your government.
Right.
And that is just the bottom line. And so if the government is trying to get guns taken out of your hands, right? I mean, the government is no one's going to tell you, hey, I'm going to come over tonight and break in your house. You better be ready, right? They're just going to break in your house and steal your stuff, right? So if the government is trying to take guns from you because they want you to be more dependent upon them, they're not going to tell you that's why they're doing that.
No.
Right? And so that is what it is. And people could say that is then a conspiracy or whatever. And I mean, I guess maybe it is a weird conspiracy thing.
Everything's a conspiracy till it happens.
Yeah. So I think, we should own guns, and we should own guns because it is a legitimate check on our government.
And if we didn't own guns, if they succeeded, do you assume that the government would immediately take over?
No, not necessarily. No, I think most things are going to happen more slowly than you would think they would. So I don't. If guns were broadly outlawed in the United States, to get there, the deterioration of our society would be pretty significant. It like all of the things would happen together.
There's a lot to snowball.
Yep. So I think guns are important. Guns are a symbol of freedom. Guns are a symbol, not in and of itself, but a symbol of potential competence and masculinity, right? Again, you have to be willing to go do the thing.
Right.
And then the people that come along and argue and say, oh, you and your little stupid AR-15 or your hunting rifle, you really think you're going to be able to fight the U.S. military? And no, but as long as I'm willing and able to fight, they're probably not going to want to fight me.
Right.
Because that is a challenge. Because again, it goes back to, we were talking about people don't like conflict, right? So,
especially because you have to remember, it's not the government against you; it's other humans against you, and they will have that moral, I don't want to shoot another human.
Yep.
And is there a limit to the Second Amendment? If we are to defend ourselves from the government, I would assume not, but should we have tanks?
That's an interesting question. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I would be inclined to, it's hard given our society, right? So it'd be kind of like drugs. I don't think it would be good if drugs were legalized tomorrow. It'd be chaos.
Yep.
I also don't think
Portland, for instance.
Yeah, I also don't think it'd be good if explosives and rockets and whatever else were legalized for everybody tomorrow.
Yep.
In principle, should they be legal? I don't really know.
Yeah.
Would be that is because of the particular place we are in history, it's hard to imagine. From a practical standpoint, I think it would be bad. From a principled standpoint, I guess I'm inclined to say yes, but I don't know how to reconcile that in my mind with the practical side of things then.
Right. It's like a gun in that you have to have a certain level of maturity and training and mindset and
Yeah, but it shouldn't be the government's job to enforce that either.
Right. Agreed.
So that'd be that's the weird conundrum then of how do you are there genuinely bad people that we would not want
to own a tank or a gun?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or a full auto machine gun or something like that.
100%.
For sure, there are. And so what does it look like like we currently do a thing to regulate that. It is very imperfect, and there are laws that are part of that are overreaching and bad. But there are also some of those laws that are helpful.
Yeah.
And keep bad people from having. It's a little bit harder, and that is a mercy. It doesn't mean that it is constitutional, because it's probably not. But there starts to be nuance to it, in sort of like the idea that, I guess this get me in trouble probably a lot, like 100% guns, America, the Second Amendment, and in general, like most of the law enforcement agencies that surround that are, mostly not helpful. The trendy thing to say is they're 100% not helpful. And I guess I would say it is the practical execution of it is probably going to be a little more complex of what that looks like. So
as with most things.
As with most things. Yep.
Yeah. The founding fathers, as we're kind of talking about, like pushing back against your own government, the founding fathers rebelled against England over much less. Do you ever believe America will have a second revolution where at some point American citizens will say no to the government?
So the first part of your question, I don't really know the answer to. I'm tempted to assume the same thing you're assuming, and maybe you have historical knowledge that I don't. But the idea that they rebelled against much less, there is a little bit of relativism with that, right? Because their world was different than our world. And maybe the difference in our world allows for something that genuinely is much more oppression or more. But we tend to simplify, I think, when we look back and we try to simplify in hindsight what they were facing and what they were doing. And we're like, clearly they did this thing. And I don't think it was clear to them at the time in the same way that is clear to us looking back at it.
Hindsight's 2020.
And so I think there is some subtlety there that I guess I wouldn't say that conclusively that they rebelled against much less. Emotionally, my sentiment is to want to think that as well. But I'd just qualify this with I don't actually know that. And do I think there could be a revolution of some point? Absolutely there could be. There always can be. Are we, I guess, coming out of COVID and all of the stuff that happened in the last 4 or 5 years, I am surprised at our complacency and our tolerance of things.
Yep.
And so I would like to say that we would not tolerate things and not be complacent. And that could lead to whatever it would lead to. But at this point, just because I don't like something doesn't mean the 100 million other people don't like that thing.
Right.
And there's enough.
And are willing to fight and potentially die for it.
And so that, and really the people who talk about, there's a whole lot of people who are a bunch of lame talking heads that talk about fighting for things and dying for things.
Yeah.
That when it comes down to it, I don't think they really would. They're just a bunch of blowhards. And so I think, because it's genuinely hard, right? I mean, I worked with people in law enforcement who recognized they weren't blowhards and like straight up were, if my job was to go to this person's home or to start going door to door and confiscate guns, I would go do that because I have a mortgage and a family. Like that's what they said. And I'm like, whoa, you're insane. And mental note, file that away because you don't actually believe in the Constitution like I believe in the Constitution. And when we go to some hot call and something bad happens, you're thinking about your mortgage and your family and not about what's right and wrong. And so that is a thing that exists out there for sure. And I think there's a lot of people. And that same person is a conservative person who would normally talk the conservative talk about like standing on principles and doing the right. But when it comes down to it, it's hard. Like, are you really willing to give up your fancy house and your fancy car and all of your fancy job, right? I would say the last 5 years would say that the vast majority of people are not, including a bunch of people who tout themselves to be principled conservative people.
Right.
And So that's why we are where we are today.
Yeah.
So I'm not. I think that again, like we talked about earlier, I don't think things are actually that bad to the individual. Right.
Right.
Our life is easy, and we are soft.
Very easy.
And so life has to be not easy before we're willing to actually do things.
Necessity is the mother of action.
Yep.
Yeah. So we talked about mindset, and then tactical skills, and then
Mindset,
tactics, skills,
and equipment.
Equipment.
So mindset is how you think about things and your perspective. Tactics is like manipulating a situation to your advantage. Skill is like your physical ability to do something, and equipment is just stuff that would support those things.
And Tenicor comes in with the stuff. Correct?
So we sell stuff, but our point is, by making that our tagline, is that the stuff we sell is actually not very important, which is a weird thing for a company to say.
Right.
It's not even, it's fourth, right? It's genuinely not important, right? It's only important to the extent that it makes executing your tactics and skills easier. And actually, like, basically your equipment you shouldn't even realize you have it, right? Because if you're thinking about your equipment is getting in the way of what you're trying to do. And that's going to be the case with anything, right? So like you play football, right? If your pads are not on right, or you have the wrong type of pads, they're in the way of you doing the work. Right? And you like, well, I got to fix that. So I got to or your jersey is not set up right, or just whatever is like extra stuff that's bothering you, that's a distraction, getting in the way of you executing your tactics and skills, right? So comparing it to sports would be a tactic would be like a play. Like, we're going to run a play, people are going to set screens, you're going to run this way, you're going to fake that way, you're going to do whatever. That would be tactics. Skills would be like,
can you catch the ball?
Can you catch the ball? Can you actually tackle?
Right.
Can you run? Like, those are going to be physical skills. And then all of that, it is mindset, drives all of that. So the way you increase your mindset is by getting better at your tactics and skills and having equipment that you're confident in. That will increase your mindset. But there's also a component where it's like a willingness to do hard things, or a willingness to sacrifice yourself, or a willingness to do lots, there's a willingness.
Even if you don't like the sacrifice itself, it's like, because I like something else. G.K. Chesterton once said that, like, you don't fight for against what's in front of you. You fight because you love what's behind you.
Yes.
Yeah. Alex Honnold, we watched Free Solo the other night with Alex Honnold, and he said, as far as like tactics and equipment, he went through he climbed El Cap so many times with a rope that he'd memorized every move. He knew exactly where his feet should be, and that gave him the confidence to climb it without a rope. And that's kind of what you were talking about, is if you run the play enough times, eventually it's secondhand nature, and you can perfect it and get really good at it. So that everything is systematic and logical. What's the next move?
It's actually not a risk.
Situation.
Like, you're reducing your risk.
Yes.
Because you have such a high level of competence at something.
He was saying, like, if my heart rate starts to go up, something's gone horribly wrong. Most of the time, it's perfectly calm, because I've done this move 100 times. So I'm totally calm. The situation is fine. If I start to get worried at all, something has gone horribly wrong. And it's just, do the thing 100 times until you're good at it. Yeah. Broadly, what is Tenicor? What do you guys do?
So Tenicor broadly is an A to Z American manufacturing, design, distribution, sales, and marketing company.
Manufactured right there.
So we do everything. We do pretty much everything in-house. And there's some stuff. Our main product is all designed and manufactured in-house. We have some accessory things to our main product that are done by vendors. But for the most part, the bulk of what we do is in-house. And we make concealment equipment is our primary focus. So holsters for handguns and belts and mag pouches are our primary focus. Right now, we do some other stuff sometimes when customers ask for it, but that's pretty rare, and they got to be the right customer. Yeah, so that's what we do. We design concealment equipment, and we design concealment equipment with the priorities of survival in mind. And from my perspective, most people design equipment from an equipment standpoint, and they make a widget.
Right.
And we are trying to design equipment that works with the correct mindset, tactics, and skills. And so I think about a holster design or something like that, more like it's less like designing a widget that sits on a table that does something, and it's more like designing like a prosthetic, right?
Right.
There's an integration with human performance that is required, because you need to be able to carry the gun, conceal the gun, and use the gun effectively and consistently. And if you can't, then it is not integrated into your daily life, and that's not going to work very well.
Yeah. What made you decide to start Tenicor?
To start Tenicor?
Because you were in the police
Yeah,
force
I guess
when you started.
what made me start making products was there were not products that did what I wanted them to do. So I guess I'm pretty focused on mindset, tactics, skill, and equipment, and I have been thinking in that way as a paradigm that I use for many aspects of my life that I've used for a long time. And so in law enforcement, whether it was on my patrol gear or my SWAT gear, there were many things that I had that were things that were custom made that I made myself, because like my radio pouch didn't sit exactly how I wanted it to sit for me to do my job. And so I like deconstructed a radio pouch and assembled it back together.
Things were custom. Then you had to custom design everything.
Yeah, I tried to if someone didn't make something that worked the way I wanted it to work, then I would make it myself.
Yeah.
And that's what I started doing. And so I had all kinds of stuff. I have all kinds of ideas. I've tinkered with all sorts of things. And then ultimately there was not a concealment equipment that concealed as well as I thought it should be, was as comfortable as I thought it should be, and then also held up to the stress of a violent confrontation. And so like if the gun's in your holster and someone is trying to steal it out of your holster and you're like fighting for your life over that, right? Oftentimes the holster just pops right out or the holster breaks. And those are not things that most equipment...
That's not a good situation to be in.
Yes, that would not be a good situation to be in, and those are not things that most equipment companies understand or think about when they're designing their equipment.
Right. Yeah. So is that what makes Tenicor different? Is just you've been through this, and so you understand that those are, you need this in this situation and that in that situation?
I think what makes Tenicor different is that I am a heavily analytical tinkerer, where I play with things, and I play with things until they don't work, or I play with things until they do work, and I take things apart and I put things back together, whether that is physical skill or whether that is a product, and I try to find the essence of what it's trying to do, and then I try to make the thing better so it does it better. And then I don't stop with just doing that once. I do that over and over and over and over again to try to refine it to make it better. And I'm sure there are other people out there that do that. I don't think there are people who do it to the level that I do it, particularly in this space. And I think that is what makes Tenicor different.
Yeah. What to someone who's trying to start a small business now, who's trying to get their self into that world, what would your encouragement be to them? Encouragement or advice?
Let's see. Someone who's trying to start a small business. I guess I'd probably mostly caution them. I guess it depends on what they want to do with that small business, right? So if a small business is like one or two people and you provide a service, yep, go do the thing. And you're probably really good at the thing you do. But managing and leading and having vision and growing the thing is different than just running a small business or a small team of 2 to 5 people, right?
Of you and your friends.
Totally different,
Yeah.
right? I guess I would say if you really are passionate about it and you want to do something with it, the amount of humility that is required is pretty significant. The amount of loneliness, that's something that is not talked about very often with entrepreneurs. But I think there's a lot of loneliness because nobody else, other than the genuine entrepreneur, business owner, driver of the thing, really understands or appreciates what you're doing or bears the same level of responsibility. And so you can have people that work for you, but they don't understand the responsibility, the pressure, and the tenacity that is required to drive the thing forward and do it. And I would, in my experience, there is definitely a feeling of loneliness that occurs in that, and that comes and goes at different times. So be ready for that. And if you're not willing and able to basically reinvent yourself over and over and over again, like you will be your own ceiling then.
Yeah.
Like most business owners or entrepreneurs are their own problem. And whether it is their willingness to try different things and take risks, or their willingness to let go and give things to other people, or their ability to communicate information effectively to other people, like it is the bottleneck or the constraint for businesses growing and improving is almost always the owner, founder, leader of that business, and nobody else. And at different stages of your business, you will be faced with that same problem over and over and over again. And your willingness to be humble and reinvent if you truly understand who you are and the principles you believe that drive it, you have to reinvent the tactics and skills that allow you to do that at different stages and at different times. And that's hard. It requires a whole bunch of humility to do that. So the Toyota manufacturing company, or the Toyota production system, they use a Japanese term called hansei, and that term means to basically be introspective about yourself and about how to improve and about how to change, and then put a plan in place to do it. And I think that is the essence of life. But there is a microcosm of business ownership or entrepreneurship that is crucial too. And you can't have ego and be invested in money or people or whatever that is driving you down a direction that isn't what you believe in and isn't what you need to be doing. And you got to be willing to change, to be introspective about that when you're confronted with those things, and get inputs from other people so you can get different perspectives so that you can think correctly about it, and then be humble enough to make a wholesale change if that change needs to occur. Yeah.
Where does that introspection go too far? Is there a point where you're doing too much introspecting and not enough?
I suppose it could. Everything could go too far, right?
Right.
Just like everybody being required to own a gun can go too far.
Can go too far.
If you are too introspective and you're just being introspective and not actually doing anything, that would be a problem.
So where's that level of balance?
Where is the level of balance? The balance is in performance, like you see it. Are you hitting a bottleneck and you can't progress forward because you need to change? Like that would be, don't do that. Are you sitting on your hands because you're being introspective and over analytical and not doing things? Don't do that. And you're going to bump against those. Like if you're moving forward, you're going to bump against those all the time. I think for the younger person, the temptation is going to be over analytical and over concerned about other people and insecure, and you're going to sit on your hands and not do things because you're going to be afraid to be wrong. Right? The same reason, like in a classroom, people don't want to raise their hands because they don't want to be wrong, right? Yep. And so you just got to raise your hand and say the crazy thing you're going to say, right? And be willing to be wrong and try something.
Yeah.
And as you get older, you get less concerned about that. At least most people do. And then, but as you get older, you get more stuck in your ways.
Yes.
Right? And so that's like a weird thing that occurs.
Yeah. Who is Tenicor for?
Who is Tenicor for? That's a good question. Our target audience is what we call the professionally minded user. And we don't say the professional user because there's a whole bunch of people who are paid to carry a gun that are not professionally minded about what they do. Yep. Right? And then there's a whole bunch of people.
A lot of fat cops.
Yep, there's a whole bunch of people who don't get paid that are very professionally minded about what they do.
Right.
And so I would say our target audience is the professionally minded user, and then anyone who aspires to be the professionally minded user
Yeah.
is who Tenicor is for. And Tenicor is not for the average gun owner, because I don't think the average gun owner aspires to be a professionally minded user.
Yeah. Just don't have time or whatever it is.
That's fine.
Yeah. Where can people find you online? You and Tenicor and everything else.
Let's see. I'm relatively active on Instagram at RealJeffMao. Tenicor on Instagram is at Tenicor USA. Our Tenicor YouTube channel is also pretty decent. We do a pretty good job. We put out some decent videos.
Pretty decent. Don't oversell yourself.
I mean, on the media side of things, it's a constant changing, evolving, trying to figure out
What works.
and
I
what
understand.
we're motivated to do. And so, Instagram for me and Tenicor, YouTube for Tenicor, and then obviously Tenicor.com for our website is where all our e-commerce is. But our YouTube channel has progressed quite a bit in the last 6 months, and it's pretty exciting to see. We're trying to figure out like how to structure and plan and execute content has been a fun challenge, and the media team
It's
has
a
done a great
completely
job.
different world.
Yep.
Yeah. What's the biggest piece of advice you would give to anyone watching?
Biggest piece of advice. The biggest piece of advice would be to execute, right? Whatever it is, the thing that you're interested in doing, like you should go execute that thing, like actually do it. And I could have said do stuff, but I actually mean execute it. Like that is the hardest thing. There's so many people who have so many ideas, but people don't do things. And so being okay with the failure, because the failure, like that is a truism in life, is making mistakes. That is sanctification. That is
Right.
That whole, like people want to do something and be glorified. It goes back to that, right? Because they want to be perfect if they try something. But just execute things and just do stuff over and over and over again and be willing to try stuff. And you will learn so much more, so much faster. You'll become so much more competent. And like people are afraid of they're insecure about the judgment or the perception of other people, and most people don't actually really care.
Yeah.
They don't care at all.
They're living in their own world.
Yep.
You're a side character.
Yep, and they might make fun of you or something, but they don't really care that much, and
And
it's
in
okay.
100, 200 years, we'll all be dead. I mean,
We all die.
Yeah.
That is true.
no one's going to care too much. So
Yep.
thank you for coming on.
Yep,
This has been
you're
fun.
welcome. Thanks for
There we
having me.
go. See you guys.